Hey folks, welcome back to another Dice Tower preview. I'm Mark.
And I'm Randy.
Today we're taking a look at Court of the Dead, Mourner's Call.
In Court of the Dead, heaven and hell are locked in an unending struggle, destined to last for eternity. While death is harvesting souls, he suddenly takes pity on those who pass through the underworld and decides he's going to enlist their help to form a rebellion and stop the eternal stalemate. You play as one of these mourners in the underworld, and your goal is to gather key resources and help Death realize his plan for rebellion. Court of the Dead is brought to you by Project Raygun in conjunction with Sideshow Collectibles. It plays 2 to 4 players, ages 14 and up, and each game takes approximately 90 minutes to play.
Great. Well, let's see if we can bring an end to this war between heaven and hell. All right, this is a big box game, but setup is pretty straightforward. You're going to take the Unity tokens and place them at the top of the board. There's a different number of tokens based on the number of players. And you're going to grab the number of dice, again, based on the number of players. The Etheria tokens will be set up at the bottom of the board. Then, in the Underworld Guild area, you will place the Dread's Bane token. You'll grab the court cards, shuffle them up, and place them in the center of the board. And then you will grab the Wallows cards and shuffle those up and place them at the top of the board. Now, there are 2 tracks that you're going to have to keep track of throughout the game. First, we have the Celestial Suspicion. You're going to take a token and place it at the 0 position. Then we have the Dread's Grip, and you're going to place a token at the 0 position for that track as well.
Next, take the Mourner's cards and divide them into the 3 factions of the underworld: Flesh, Bone, and Spirit, and put the cards beside the board. Each of these factions have 2 guilds, and there are miniatures for each of these guilds, so also divide them up and put them beside the board as well. Lastly, take the 2 large figures of Death and Malabestros and put them on the board, and we'll tell you in a moment what to do with them.
Next, every player will receive a player board. Now, there's several things of note here. There are influence tracks on all of these boards, and you will receive tokens and put them at their starting positions of Bone, Flesh, and Spirit. Every player will receive 2 Etheria to start, and they will receive faction tokens that again represent Bone, Spirit, and Flesh. Also, each player will receive a set of bases for figures and colored tokens that match.
Now, these tokens are used to keep track of how many figures you have in each of the guilds, and we'll tell you why that's important in a second. Next, what each player gets is a set of ulterior motives, 1 motive for each faction. Now, all the players currently have 3 tokens in front of them indicating the 3 factions.
Right.
What the players have to do is look at the 3 ulterior motives they've been given and determine which one they want to keep to hopefully get significant additional points at the end of the game.
That's right. Big money at the end of the game.
There is, if they've accomplished it. So once they've selected that particular ulterior motive, they discard the other 2. They also discard the other 2 tokens that don't match the one they've selected, and then they display the token that shows their faction on their player board. What they don't show is it's the ulterior motive card itself, because that's something they want to keep secret. Now, once every player has chosen their faction based upon their ulterior motive card, all players get a starting mourner. Now, starting mourner cards are indicated by a symbol in the upper right. So each player gets to select from the starting mourner cards which mourner they want to select. And then they get, you'll see a little figure in the lower left here, they'll get the appropriate matching miniature that corresponds to that particular guild. And as Mark said, every player has their own player bases or figure bases, so then they'll attach that right away, and this figure goes onto their player board in the crypt area. They will also take one of those little markers, as we mentioned before, and they will put it in the appropriate guild area so people can see who has figures of that particular guild, because there are rewards based upon having the most figures in each of the 6 guilds. The last thing you do in setup is to take the Death figure, also known as the All-Taker, and give that figure to the person in the group who is the oldest, because that, in theory, that player is the closest to death.
Right.
Now, in addition to just poking fun of that person for being old, there's a benefit to this. The Death figure indicates who is the starting player in each round.
Right.
It also allows that person to break ties in terms of locations and guild ties.
Becomes very important.
It can indeed. So there's a negative there, but there's also a positive.
Indeed. All right, let's take a look at a round. Now there's a handy reference card to keep you on track because there are 8 phases to a round. The first phase is the Etheria distribution. And what happens is the first player will take the dice, roll them, and grab that number of Etheria from the supply. The first player then will divide these up into piles based on the number of players plus 1. Interesting thing is that he can put any number he wants into these piles. A pile could have 0.
It could have 0, it could have all of them, or any number in between,
Exactly.
Right?
Now, he, as the first player, gets last choice, though. So the player to his left will get to choose first. And there's a couple options. You don't have to take Etheria. Instead, you could take Influence and add it to your player board. But Etheria is pretty important, at least initially in the game.
It is, and we'll talk about that in a second.
And if there's any Etheria left over, it's all going to go to the Dearth Forge. And we'll tell you why that's important in a bit.
In phase 2 of a round, each player is given a Wallows card. Now, what a Wallows card is a quest that's been handed down from the Court of the Dead to each player.
Right.
Now, in the same way the ulterior motive is an objective you're trying to achieve by the end of the game, the Wallows cards represent an objective you're trying to achieve by the end of the round. And if you don't complete it by the end of the round, it's discarded. Now, some of these quests involve battle. If you have a particular figure in a particular location, the Wallows card gives you a chance to do battle by rolling a dice. Other ones represent artifacts, and if you have certain conditions that are met, you might actually be able to keep that artifact for the rest of the game and be able to utilize its power. But if you don't meet those conditions, the artifact goes away. So these are short-term objectives that can significantly influence how the game is played.
All right, phase 3 is court card drafting. Now, based on the number of players, it will be different number of cards that get dealt, but basically what happens is everyone gets cards in their hand, they're going to pick one and pass the cards, and you do this until the draft is complete.
Now, these particular cards represent lieutenants in Death's army.
Right.
And they typically have 2 possible actions. They have an upper action and a lower action.
And it gives you choices.
It does give you choices, and these are going to be in your hand when we start the 4th phase. The 4th phase of a round is the action phase. During this phase, each player will take a turn, and turns will continue around the table until each player has passed. A player's turn can be one of 5 different actions. The first action is playing a court card. And as we mentioned, most of the court cards have 2 different actions on them, and you get to choose between them. Now, there are a couple of court cards that are special, and I want to make certain I mention them while we're here. The first one is the death card, and it also has 2 different actions. But in either case, the person who plays this card takes control of the death figure and becomes the first player next round, and also has the ability to break ties in the case of locations and guild ties. The other one is for the other figure here. He is named Malavestros, and you could think of him as the Loki of this particular scenario.
That's exactly what he is.
So what Malavestros does is when you play this card, one of the actions allows you to place Malavestros on any location. And what he does kind of reminds me of the thief in Settlers of Catan.
Right.
He shuts down the special ability of that location. Yep. So if you see a bunch of your teammates gathering in a particular area and vying over a particular thing, you can drop Malavestros there and make their days less productive. The other thing he can do is he can shut down an ability on a mourner's card. We'll come to that in a second. So these particular playing court cards are one of the first of 5 different types of actions you can take. The second type of action you can take on your turn is to recruit. And you can recruit either particular figures or a figure and a guild card. And this is why Etheria is so important. Because you can pay 3 Etheria and recruit one of these particular figures, put your base on it, put it in your crypt, and prepare it to be moved to a particular location. Now, placing figures and locations are how you accomplish a lot of special powers.
Yep.
Mark will tell you about that in a second. The other thing you can do, though, is recruit both a figure and a mourner card. Now, this costs a little bit more. It costs 5 Etheria instead of 3, but the significance of these mourner cards are they have special powers associated with them, and these sit in front of you throughout the rest of the game. Some of these powers are triggered once when they're revealed. Other powers are triggered when certain conditions are met, and other ones are triggered as an option on your turn. And that is the third type of action you can take on your turn, and that is to do whatever is appropriate here, meet the condition, and trigger that particular mourner's action. So accumulating these in front of you might be a good way to get additional powers and give you additional choices. Yeah. And that's why Malavestros can not only screw up a particular location, but he can also shut down a particular mourner's card if he finds one's very
really
powerful.
Quite effective, actually, because the other thing is that when those cards trigger, a lot of time they flip over, and you won't get to use them again until later in the cleanup phase.
Right.
But the next possible action is you can relocate your figures. So all these spots out on the board, there's numerous things that you're gonna acquire when you're in any one of these spots if you have the most figures there. But really, you're looking over in the main icon of the board, and these icons are what you're gonna have to pay in influence. So if you're moving from one spot to the other, you're gonna have to pay influence to move those figures.
Yeah, you can think of it as when you're going to a different country, you might need to pay an entry fee based upon the currency of that country. And in this case, it's the influence of that particular location.
And it's a real trade-off to see what you're gonna get from those spots potentially, because you're spending influence to do this, and influence is one of the big ways to get points at the end of the game.
Right. Now, this is where the area control aspect of Court of the Dead comes in. So with fewer players, it might be a little bit easier to get control of certain areas because there's not as many figures on the board. But as you get more players, there's a lot more competition here.
Definitely. And then finally, like Randy said at the beginning, you can pass. And once everyone has passed, then you move on to the next phase.
Now, the difference between this and conventional bidding is a lot of times once you've passed, you're done for you don't get a chance. But if you pass and other players play, you can actually get another chance to play. It's not until all players have passed sequentially that the round or the action phase is over.
All right, so now we're moving to phase 5 and really phase 6 because both of these phases deal with the 2 tracks. Now, the interesting thing about these tracks is that this is the part of the game where you probably are somewhat collectively working together to keep these tracks on a lower scale.
Right. So
they don't affect everybody quite so badly.
And what you'll find is when you play court cards, when you recruit figures, figures and mourner cards, what you'll find is, in addition to the good aspect you get, you oftentimes have to raise the counters on these tracks.
Exactly.
So, for example, when you recruit a guild figure, you always have to move the Dread's Grip marker up by 1.
Indeed. Now, the Dread's Grip threat is the first thing that we're going to look at in phase 5. And what happens is, any area at the low end of the threat marker, anybody that has, any area I should say, that has more than 3 figures in it, will then every player will have to roll dice against their figure.
Right. So the Dread's Grip threat indicates the maximum number of figures that can be on any particular location.
Indeed.
So in the underworld, they don't have the right to lawful assembly. Okay?
Indeed. And if you roll a 1, oh, it's bad. That figure is destroyed.
Yeah, the premise is you have this thing called the Dread's Grip, which is a corrupting force in the underworld.
Indeed.
And as you get more and more figures there, more and more people, there's a premise that there's more likelihood people are going to get, or figures are going to get corrupted. Right. So if you roll a 1, that figure is considered that he is corrupted. He's become a raker.
Yep.
And must be destroyed. So he's out. You take the base off, and he is out of the game.
Well, out of your hand.
Out of your hand, exactly. It goes back to the supply, yes.
And then if you roll a 2, you're a little bit more fortunate, although you might lose majority of a spot, and it is bad because if you're trying to achieve whatever the goods are that you're trying to pull off from that area, you might lose out because what's going to happen is it's going to return to your crypt. So it's going to reduce the number of figures you have in that spot.
So he's been influenced by the Dread's Grip, but he hasn't been totally corrupted and become a raker. So he has to basically
take a time out.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, taking a time out. And then if you roll a 3 or higher, then you're fine.
Exactly.
You're good to go.
Exactly. So the reason you want to keep the Dread's Grip down in most cases is because there's a threat of you either losing a figure entirely or at least having come back to your player board. Now there's an exception. One of the guilds has as its reward this Dread's Bane token.
Yes.
And if you possess this, and this can change hands at the end of every round, but if you possess this Dread's Bane token, it means you are immune from this and do not have to roll during the Dread's Grip threat portion of phase 5.
And it's an interesting thing, too, about how there's you're battling over this token.
Yeah.
It's definitely worth doing.
Now, there's a reason you might not be trying to keep this particular track down, because if you see a lot of other people congregating in a place, and maybe if you have this,
you're
you
like,
say,
fine.
let the corrupting force take over them. I'm immune here. So there are reasons you might not be kind of a collaborative spirit here, and you might let this go up as you're getting benefits. You don't necessarily consider this a negative.
Exactly. All right, so phase 6 is the other track. You're going to pay the celestial tithe. First, you're going to look at what the value is. And even at 0 on the track, it's still expensive, the tithe. It's the number of players plus 3. And as this number moves up the track, it gets even more expensive. I mean, greatly more expensive.
Now, what's going on here is Etheria is basically the currency that funds the battle between heaven and hell.
Yep.
And the whole point of Death harvesting souls is he collects from the souls this substance called Etheria and helps funnel it up to the war.
That's right.
Now, while this is going on, while the war is going on and Death is creating his rebellion, he's got to make certain he's not discovered.
That we're not seen.
Yeah, so as things are going on, he has to kind of funnel more and more of this Etheria up there to cover up his activities. And that's why as this track moves up, it's more expensive.
That's right. Now, everyone has an opportunity to contribute to make this tithe happen. And again, this is where the collectiveness comes into the game. And everyone will pull their Etheria from their card and secretly bid it out.
Choose a subset of it.
Choose a subset of it and bid it and flip the hand over and then see if we have enough to pay the tithe.
Right.
Now there's penalties, right?
There's benefits and penalties, and you can, before this happens, because you're going to be adding whatever's contributed by the players to what's in the Dearth Forge already. And if you remember that the Dearth Forge is sometimes populated with Etheria during the Etheria distribution phase when people don't choose particular piles.
So we might have a starting number.
Yeah,
already.
you might have a decent number. But what you can do is you say, well, tell you what, if you give one and I give one, Mark gives one, we're all going to be good. But there are benefits for the players who are most cooperative, and there are penalties for the ones who are least. So if, after you've totaled up all the Etheria that's contributed, add that to the Dearth Forge, if you've made the minimum amount required for the tithe, good things happen overall. So the person who's contributed the most gets 3 of these unity tokens, which count as points at the end of the game. Everybody other than the person who contributed the most gets 1 unity token. If somebody didn't contribute any, well, they got the benefit of having kept all their Etheria, but it does cost them 1 influence.
It does.
Now, let's say, in the worst case, you didn't get enough Etheria to
This is what's really bad.
This is the bad thing that happens. So first thing that happens is the marker on each of these tracks
both
tracks go up by 2. So life is hard. The person who contributed the least loses 2 unity tokens, and again, these are points at the end of the game.
Yes, they are.
Now, if the I believe the Etheria track is at its maximum, then the person who contributed the least or none at all has to pay 3 more unity.
Yes.
And if the Dread's Grip track is at its top, then the person who didn't contribute any or contributed the least has to give up 1 of his mourner cards and the associated guild figure.
Yeah. It's pretty brutal. These tracks really can bankrupt everybody.
It can, and the important thing is, as we understand it, that this does not signify the end of the game. It's like, okay, things are as bad as they can possibly be, so we're done, right? No, you're not done.
Not until the unity runs out.
Yeah, so basically you might have to experience this repeatedly as rounds go by, and this could, as you said, it could bankrupt many people in the game before you run out of unity tokens. So after the harsh penalties of phases 5 and 6 as you're dealing with these different tracks, phase 7 is, if you've survived, is where you collect your rewards from both locations and the guilds. So for each location, you start with 1, which is over here, I believe, on the Dearth Forge, and you work around numerically through all the locations. The player who has the most figures in that location
reap the benefits.
Gets the appropriate benefit. And there are a variety of benefits. But again, what you're going to see here is in many cases, good things come along with bad things.
Yeah,
so, like,
almost
for example,
always.
Yeah, you get... This one actually has a benefit of the Dread's Grip goes down and you get an additional influence and a unity token, but then it causes the Celestial Suspicion to go up by 1. So oftentimes this is a mixed bag.
It really is.
Yeah, so if you don't...
There's tracks out here that just give you influence too, and that's
so
all they do.
There's positive things. So in any case, you go through this and determine which player has the most control in each of these locations, and that player only gets the benefit of that location. Likewise, for each of these guild areas, these 6 guilds, you will do the same thing. You will say, if a player has the most figures of that particular guild type, he gets the associated benefit. And I believe if there's a tie...
then whoever is death...
Well,
right?
Death has the opportunity once per round
True.
to break a tie
Yep.
between either in a guild location, or I'm sorry, either in a location or a guild.
Yep.
Yes. Now, otherwise, if there's a tie, then nobody gets the benefit.
Yeah.
So that's phase 7, and everybody reaps the rewards, and you proceed to the cleanup phase.
All right, phase 8 is just the cleanup phase. And if you have any Mourners cards that have triggers at the end of the round, then they trigger now. And if you've used any Mourners cards throughout the round, now they flip back over and are readied for the next go. So the other thing you're going to check is if there's any Unity tokens left. If there aren't, then it's going to trigger the game end.
The end of the game is triggered when the last Unity token is taken. Now, if this happens during the action phase, each player gets one more turn, including the player who actually triggered the end of the game.
Right.
And then the remainder of the phases for that round are played, including the cleanup phase.
Yep.
Now, it can also occur that the last Unity token is taken after the action phase. And again, if that occurs, then the remainder of the phases are completed through the cleanup phase. Once the cleanup phase is complete, then scores are tabulated.
Right.
Now, it's important to recognize that there's a variety of ways to score points in this game. One of them is through influence.
Yeah.
So what happens here is that you'll see on your player board, you'll see where your markers are kept for each of the individual factions, but it's not the location, it's not the marker itself. It's not like this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
There's a group.
There's a grouping. For those who are familiar with logarithms, this is kind of a logarithmic scale in the sense that the more you get, so that down here you might have this many influence and get 6. But as you get further up, all of a sudden you jump to 10, then you jump to 13, then if you have maxed out any particular track, then you get a total of 15.
Right. It's really worth a lot of points.
It is. And so that's why you might choose to say, well, I don't necessarily want this type of influence, I want this other type of influence, because that will push me to the very end and I'll get maximum points for that. So you will add up all the points shown across the top of the player board for each of your influence tracks. You'll get 1 point for each Unity token you have, and you'll also get points for your ulterior motive.
Yeah.
Now, your ulterior motive can be a variety of things. This one right here says gain 2 points for each flesh guild figure you control at the end of the game. Other ones might say you get 4 points for every Spirit Mourner card you have in your control at the end of the game.
Or if you have Etheria, you might get extra points.
Yeah, it might give you points for Etheria, but only if it's on your card. Otherwise, Etheria is not worth anything.
Exactly.
Your Mourner cards, just having them aren't worth anything. Figures aren't inherently worth anything.
So if you see someone hoarding Etheria, you might be a clue that that's their ulterior motive.
Exactly. So there are some ways you might be able to figure out what they're trying to do here.
Right.
But ultimately, add up the points from your influence, add up the points from your Unity tokens, add up the points for your ulterior motive, and whoever has the most points wins the game.
All right, folks, just a reminder once again, this has been a Dice Tower paid preview, and everything you've seen here has been in prototype form. So the rules and artwork still might be in flux, so keep a close eye on the campaign for any changes. Now that said, I really like the artwork, and I'm a big fan of miniatures and games, and there's a lot of things going on in this game, some really neat decision making going on. Yeah,
and I agree with Mark. The artwork, especially on the cards, the Mourner cards, and also on the court cards, it's really beautiful.
Yep.
I also like the fact that there's this uneasy alliance going on. Yeah, and there are sometimes it's easy to get so involved with getting your stuff, like getting your influence, that you kind of let the tracks run away with you.
They do, and when those tracks run away, it gets pretty hectic.
Yeah, they get bad really fast. Yep. So I think that always having to focus on those things, focusing on multiple vectors at the same time makes it a challenging game.
I think there was that moment in the game where I was like, oh man, that went wrong so fast.
It did, right? It did, yes.
So you really have to keep an eye on those tracks, and you really do have to work together on those.
Agreed.
All right, folks, so if this looks like a game that would be of interest to you, I'm sure they would appreciate your support.
Absolutely.
And I think that's it from us. And until next time, we'll see you at the table.
Thanks so much for watching the Dice Tower videos. Find more great videos and reviews, as well as our top-rated audio podcast at Dicetower.com. You can also find other great shows at Dicetowernetwork.com. I'm Eric Summerer, and you've been watching the Dice Tower. The Dice Tower is sponsored by Cool Stuff Inc., where you can find great games for great prices. Cool stuff in stock. Check them out at CoolStuffInc.com.